The extraction had gone catastrophically wrong in the shadow of the wall, and now Dmitry Volkov and Pavel Sokolov sat with their wrists bound behind their backs in the rear of an unmarked van, racing through the rain-slicked streets of West Berlin. The metallic taste of blood filled Dmitry's mouth where the American agent had struck him during the capture, and beside him, Pavel's labored breathing suggested at least one broken rib. They had been so close to the checkpoint, mere meters from safety, when the ambush came from 3 directions at once. Through the small window, Dmitry caught glimpses of neon signs in English and German, each one a reminder that they were deep in enemy territory. Now, beyond any hope of rescue, the van's tires hissed against wet pavement, carrying them further from everything they knew and closer to whatever fate the Americans had planned. Inside the KGB's training facility outside Moscow, their instructors had prepared them for this exact scenario with clinical precision. They had memorized protocols for capture, practiced resistance techniques against interrogation, and steeled themselves with stories of Soviet heroes who died protecting state secrets. But no amount of training could suppress the cold dread settling into Dmitry's bones as the van slowed and turned, gravel crunching beneath the wheels. Pavel caught his eye in the darkness, and Dmitry saw his own fear reflected there, raw and undeniable. Their mission, photographing NATO communication installations near the American sector, had seemed straightforward enough when the orders came down from Moscow Center. Now, it felt like a death sentence. The van doors swung open to reveal a nondescript building surrounded by high walls. Topped with wire, its windows dark except for a single light burning on the ground floor. American voices barked orders in English as rough hands pulled them from the vehicle and marched them through a steel door. The corridor smelled of concrete dust and machine oil, sounds echoing off bare walls that had surely witnessed countless other prisoners passing through. Dmitry's mind raced through the possibilities, each one darker than the last. They pushed him into a windowless room with a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, its harsh light casting sharp shadows across the bare walls. The door slammed shut with a finality that seemed to seal their fate, leaving them alone in the silence that follows capture. The holding cell measured perhaps 3 meters by 4, its concrete walls painted an institutional grey that seemed to absorb hope itself. A single metal table sat bolted to the floor in the center, flanked by 2 chairs that looked salvaged from a schoolhouse, their wooden seats worn smooth by countless previous occupants. Dmitry's shoulders ached from the plastic restraints cutting into his wrists, while Pavel slumped against the far wall, one arm wrapped protectively around his injured ribs, his face pale beneath the unforgiving fluorescent light. The silence pressed down on them like a physical weight, broken only by the distant hum of machinery somewhere deep within the building, and the occasional footsteps passing in the corridor outside. Through the ventilation grate near the ceiling, cold air whispered into the room, carrying with it the faint smell of cigarette smoke and coffee, reminders that their captors were close, watching, waiting. Time seemed to stretch and contract. Simultaneously in that colorless space, each minute feeling like an hour, while the approach of dawn raced toward them with terrible inevitability. Pavel spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper in Russian, the language itself now a fragile thread connecting them to home. "They will start with sleep deprivation," he said, reciting from their training manual as if the familiar words could provide some measure of control over the uncontrollable. Then isolation, sensory manipulation, perhaps waterboarding, if the rumors about their black site protocols are true. Dmitry nodded slowly, his throat too dry to respond immediately, remembering the grainy photographs they had studied during briefings at Yasenevo headquarters, images of captured agents who never returned, their fates classified even within KGB archives. The instructors had spoken with cold certainty about American methods, painting vivid pictures of windowless rooms beneath embassies where screams went unheard and broken. Men signed confessions in languages they barely understood, Every agent knew the statistics, whispered in training dormitories late at night. Fewer than 1 in 10 captured operatives ever made it to a prisoner exchange, the rest disappearing into the vast machinery of Cold War retribution. "My family," Pavel began, then stopped, the words catching in his chest like shrapnel. His wife Katya taught literature at Moscow State University, and their daughter Anya had just turned 7, her gap-toothed smile frozen in the photograph he carried in a hidden pocket that the Americans had surely already found and catalogued. Dmitri thought of his own mother in Leningrad, still lighting candles for his father, who never came home from the siege, now destined to light them for a son who vanished behind the wall. They had both written letters before this mission as protocol demanded, carefully worded final messages that would be delivered only if they failed to return, sanitized versions of goodbye that could never capture the full weight of what they wanted to say. The KGB would tell their families they died serving the motherland, heroes of the Soviet Union, omitting the part where their own intelligence chiefs had sent them into a trap with incomplete information and compromised cover identities. The propaganda films they had watched during ideological training played through Dmitri's mind like a dark carnival. Americans, portrayed as savage imperialists who tortured prisoners without mercy, who violated every convention of warfare in their obsession with extracting secrets. He had believed those images once, absorbed them as truth during his years of service, but now facing the reality of capture, doubt crept in alongside the fear. Would they really be executed by a dawn? Or was that assumption itself a product of the very indoctrination meant to keep them loyal unto death? Pavel's breathing grew more labored as the hours crawled past, each exhale a reminder of fragility, of how quickly the human body could be broken by those who knew its weaknesses. Outside their cell, the building settled into the deep quiet of midnight, and both men understood with terrible clarity that whatever came next would define not just how they died, but whether their lives had meant anything at all. Dmitri Volkov had been 9 years old when the Germans reached the outskirts of Leningrad, young enough to still believe in the invincibility of the motherland, old enough to understand the meaning of the hunger that followed. His father, a machinist at the Kirov plant, had vanished into the defense battalions during the first winter of the siege, leaving behind only a wool cap and promises that never materialized into homecoming. Through 900 days of artillery bombardment and starvation, Dmitri learned that survival meant loyalty to something larger than himself, that individual suffering was merely a drop in the ocean of collective sacrifice. The party representatives who came to his school after the liberation spoke of resilience and revenge, of building a Soviet Union so strong that such horrors could never happen again. Those words took root in the fertile soil of his grief, growing into an unshakable conviction that he owed everything to the system that had saved his city, his country, his very existence from fascist annihilation. Pavel Andreev's path to the KGB had been more deliberate, shaped by privilege rather than trauma, though both roads led to the same windowless offices in Moscow, where young men traded their futures for the security of the state. His father had been a decorated colonel in the NKVD, one of the old guard who survived the purges through careful political navigation and unwavering ideological purity. Pavel grew up in a world of whispered conversations and sudden disappearances, learning early that asking questions was dangerous, but serving without question opened doors. At Moscow State University, he studied languages with the kind of excellence that attracted attention from certain departments, and when the recruitment officer appeared in his final year, the offer felt less like a choice than a destiny fulfilled. He believed then, truly, believed that the Americans represented an existential threat to everything his father's generation had built from the ashes of war. Their training at the Red Banner Institute had been comprehensive and brutal, stripping away whatever remained of individual identity and rebuilding them as instruments of Soviet intelligence. They memorized the Faces of CIA operatives studied the layouts of Western embassies, learned to forge documents and crack safes and kill silently if necessity demanded. The instructors emphasized repeatedly that the capitalist enemy showed no mercy to captured agents, that American intelligence services were staffed by men who viewed Russians as subhuman obstacles to global domination. Every lesson reinforced the central narrative. They were soldiers in an invisible war where the stakes were nothing less than the survival of socialism itself, and surrender meant betrayal not just of country, but of history's inevitable march toward justice. Now, sitting in this grey cell with dawn approaching like an executioner's footsteps, both men confronted the possibility that all those years of certainty had been preparation for a death that might prove meaningless. The propaganda that had shaped their worldview felt suddenly paper-thin against the weight of mortality, yet neither could imagine believing anything else, trapped as they were between the ideology that defined them and the approaching moment when definitions would cease to matter. The cell smelled of damp concrete and old fear, a scent Dmitri recognized from the basement shelters of Leningrad, where families had huddled during bombardments, waiting to learn if they would see another sunrise. Pavel sat across from him on the narrow metal bench, his face pale in the weak light filtering through the single-barred window, fingers drumming an unconscious pattern against his knee that betrayed the calm expression he was trying to maintain. They had been silent for nearly an hour, each man alone with thoughts too dangerous to speak aloud, until Pavel finally broke the quiet with words that came out hoarse and fractured. "They will come before dawn," he said in Russian, the language itself a small defiance, a reminder of who they were even here in enemy hands. That is when these things are always done, when resistance is lowest, when the body wants only to surrender to whatever ending is offered. Dmitri nodded slowly, watching shadows shift across the opposite wall as clouds moved beyond the window, each change in light feeling like time accelerating toward an inevitable conclusion. "Do you think it will be quick?" he asked, hating the weakness in his voice but unable to suppress it, the trained operative giving way to the frightened child who had once believed the siege would never end. Pavel's jaw tightened, and for a moment something raw showed through his careful control, a glimpse of the man beneath the manufactured loyalty. The instructor at the institute said the Americans use drugs, that they break you slowly until you beg to tell them everything, that death comes only after you have betrayed everyone you ever loved, he said, repeating the lessons that now felt like curses rather than preparation. The words hung between them like smoke, poisoning the air with images neither wanted to contemplate but could not escape. Outside, footsteps echoed in the corridor, and both men went rigid, bodies responding to threat even as minds tried to prepare for what training had warned them to expect. "If they separate us," Dmitri whispered urgently, leaning forward, "if they offer you a way out, you must remember that whatever they promise is designed only to extract intelligence, that our duty remains clear even when everything else becomes confusion." Pavel met his eyes, and in that exchange passed an understanding deeper than ideology, the recognition that they faced this darkness together, two men who had become brothers through shared belief, now bound by shared doom. The footsteps faded past their door, continuing down the hallway to some other prisoner's reckoning, granting them a temporary reprieve that felt more like a prolonged torture than mercy. They settled back against the cold wall, breathing again, waiting for the next sound that might announce their final hours. The sound came at midnight, a metallic scraping that cut through their shallow sleep like a blade through cloth, and both men jolted upright on the bench where exhaustion had finally claimed them. Despite their terror, the door handle turned with excruciating slowness, each mechanical click amplified in the confined space until it seemed loud enough to wake the dead, and Dmitri felt his heart hammering against his ribs with such force he thought it might shatter bone. Pavel's hand found his arm in the darkness, gripping with desperate strength. a final gesture of solidarity before whatever horror was about to unfold, and in that touch Dmitri felt the sum of their shared journey from Moscow to this moment, all the choices and beliefs that had led them to this cell in a foreign land. The door swung inward, revealing not the harsh fluorescent glare they had expected, but the softer glow of hallway lights behind a single silhouetted figure. A man whose face remained shadowed, but whose posture suggested neither aggression nor urgency, merely purpose. He stepped inside, carrying something in his hands, and every muscle in Dmitri's body tensed for violence, his training screaming at him to fight or flee, even as reason told him. Both options were futile, that their fate had been sealed the moment the operation collapsed near the checkpoint. The American guard moved with quiet deliberation, his footsteps barely whispering against the concrete floor as he approached the small table bolted to the wall between their benches, and Dmitri noticed details with the hyper-clarity that fear brings. The way the man's uniform was crisp but worn at the cuffs, suggesting long service rather than parade ground display. What he carried became visible as he set it down with careful precision. 2 metal cups that caught the dim light, and a wrapped bundle that proved to be bread when he unfolded the cloth, simple provisions placed before them like an offering whose meaning remained impossibly unclear. Pavel spoke then, his Russian words tumbling out in confusion and challenge, asking what this was, what they were expected to do, whether this was the last meal before execution or some elaborate psychological game designed to unmake their resistance. The guard straightened, his eyes moving between them with an expression that held neither malice nor sympathy, merely a kind of professional distance that was somehow more unsettling than hatred would have been. And for a long moment he simply stood there, as if measuring them against some internal standard. Then he turned, without speaking a single word, his silence more profound than any threat could have been, leaving them alone with the cups and bread as the door closed with a soft click that echoed like a pronouncement of judgment. Dmitri stared at the offerings, his mind racing through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last, remembering lectures about truth serums dissolved in water and poisons that worked slowly to loosen tongues before stopping hearts. The cups sat there innocent and terrible, condensation beginning to form on their metal surfaces in the cool air, each droplet sliding downward like a tiny countdown to a decision neither man felt prepared to make. Pavel leaned forward, his face a mask of suspicion and desperate thirst. The fundamental human need for water warring with training that screamed, this must be a trap, that nothing given by the enemy could be accepted without consequence. "We cannot trust this," Pavel whispered, but his voice carried the weight of a man trying to convince himself rather than state a certainty, and Dmitri heard in those words the same terrible doubt that was growing in his own chest like a cold flower. They sat in the restored darkness, 2 prisoners caught between the propaganda that had shaped their entire lives and the inexplicable reality of simple mercy from those they had been taught to fear above all others. Hours passed in paralyzed indecision, the cups sitting untouched on the table like artifacts from another world, their presence transforming the cell into a laboratory where 2 subjects wrestled with variables they had never been trained to calculate. Dmitri found himself staring at the water with an intensity that bordered on madness, his thirst growing from discomfort to genuine suffering as his body betrayed his mind's caution, demanding the relief that sat mere steps away, yet might as well have been on another continent. Pavel paced the narrow space between bench and wall, 3 steps forward and 3 steps back, a caged rhythm that spoke of mounting desperation and the slow erosion of certainty, his shadow dancing across the concrete, in the dim light that seeped under the door like an unwelcome witness to their torment. The bread remained wrapped, somehow more innocent than the water, yet equally suspect, and Dmitri remembered training sessions in the forests outside the capital, where instructors had demonstrated a dozen ways to hide death in ordinary things, lessons that now haunted every calculation. "Perhaps they want us weak from thirst," Pavel said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them like barbed wire, his voice hoarse from hours without speaking or drinking, each word carrying the weight of a man talking himself toward a precipice he could not see clearly. Dmitri considered this theory alongside all the others that had cycled through his exhausted mind, the possibility that dehydration was itself the interrogation technique, that their captors were content to let basic biology accomplish what violence might fail to achieve, breaking them down to raw need, stripped of ideology or resistance. But another thought kept surfacing. Despite his attempts to suppress it, a dangerous whisper that suggested the water might be exactly what it appeared, that perhaps the propaganda that had shaped their understanding of the enemy was itself the poison they should have feared most. Pavel stopped pacing and stood before the table, his hand hovering above one of the cups like a man, reaching toward flame, knowing it will burn but unable to resist the pull of warmth in freezing darkness. And in his trembling fingers, Dmitri saw the reflection of his own internal war between survival instinct and lifelong conditioning. "If we are to die anyway," Pavel said quietly, his words barely audible yet carrying the full weight of surrender to uncertainty. "Does it matter whether it is from thirst or from whatever they have planned?" He lifted the cup, its metal surface catching light like a mirror reflecting all the choices and beliefs that had led them to this moment, and brought it slowly to his lips. Pavel drank deeply, his throat working with desperate gulps that echoed in the concrete silence like a confession of weakness. And when he lowered the cup with water dripping from his chin, he met Dmitri's eyes with an expression caught between relief and shame. Nothing happened. No burning sensation, no sudden paralysis, no metallic taste that would herald the arrival of death, just the simple, overwhelming satisfaction of thirst being quenched after hours of self-inflicted suffering. Dmitri watched his companion for signs of distress, counting heartbeats against the possibility of delayed effects, but Pavel simply stood there, breathing heavily, his body visibly relaxing as the water worked through his system, like a key turning in a lock they had not realized was fastened. Minutes stretched forward with agonizing slowness as they both waited for consequences that refused to arrive. And finally, Dmitri reached for his own cup, surrendering to need and the strange, disorienting possibility that their captors were not the monsters their training had painted across every American face. The water was cold and clean, tasting of nothing except the absolute defeat of certainty, washing away not just thirst, but something deeper, the comfortable architecture of a world divided neatly into heroes and villains, comrades and enemies, truth and lies. Morning arrived, not with executions, but with the sound of footsteps in the corridor beyond their cell, measured and unhurried, the walk of men conducting business rather than delivering death sentences. The door opened to reveal a middle-aged man in a grey suit that spoke of government service without military decoration, his face unremarkable, except for eyes that carried the weight of too many secrets and not enough sleep, the universal expression of intelligence officers on both sides of the Iron Curtain. He carried a folder tucked under one arm and held a third cup of water in his hand, which he placed on the table with the same casual gesture the guard had used hours before, transforming what had been a mystery into something approaching routine. His Russian was flawless, bearing the slight Moscow accent that told them he had learned the language not from books, but from years of immersion, perhaps from Soviet defectors or in language schools, where American students practiced becoming other people. "Good morning, gentlemen," he said with professional courtesy that contained neither warmth nor hostility, settling into the single chair across from their bench, as though this were an office meeting rather than an interrogation. "My name is irrelevant, but you may call me Robert if it makes this conversation easier." He opened his folder without ceremony, revealing photographs that made both prisoners stiffen with recognition, surveillance images of their handlers in Moscow, organizational charts of their directorate, cables containing operational details that should have been locked in safes 3 levels below Lubyanka. His next words landed like artillery shells in the small space between them, each syllable precisely aimed to shatter what remained of their certainties about loyalty, mission, and the value their superiors had placed on their lives. "We need to discuss why your own people sent you to die," Robert said quietly, his tone carrying something that sounded disturbingly like sympathy. And in that moment, the real interrogation finally began. Not of their secrets, but of everything they had believed about the world and their place within it. Robert slid the photographs across the table with deliberate precision, each image landing like evidence in a trial where Pavel and Dmitri had not realized they were the defendants rather than the accused. The first showed their handler Volkov meeting with a known double agent in a Vienna cafe 3 months before their deployment, the "Here, sir" camera angle suggesting surveillance that had been ongoing for years rather than days. The second captured organizational cables routing through channels that bypassed normal security protocols, marked with priority designations that experienced operatives recognized as the bureaucratic language of expendability. Missions designed to fail, so other operations could succeed in the shadows of their sacrifice. Pavel felt his stomach twist as he recognized the signature codes from his final briefing, understanding now what his training had never prepared him to see, that their mission parameters had contained impossibilities disguised as challenges, objectives crafted not for achievement but for the valuable noise their failure would create across the intelligence landscape. "Your directorate needed a distraction," Robert continued in that same quiet voice that carried no triumph, only the weary recognition of patterns repeated across both sides of the ideological divide. "3 days before your deployment, we rolled up a Soviet network. In Hamburg, 12 agents, 2 years of infrastructure, gone in a single night because someone in Moscow Center got careless or perhaps ambitious." He tapped another photograph showing Checkpoint Charlie from an overhead angle, marking positions where East German Stasi had been conspicuously absent during their operation, creating a corridor that looked like opportunity but functioned as a funnel leading directly toward capture. Dmitri's hands clenched involuntarily as the tactical picture reconstructed itself in his mind with terrible clarity, seeing now how their careful planning had been undermined not by American cleverness, but by Soviet architecture, by superiors who had painted targets on their backs and sent them walking toward enemy guns. The realization arrived not as shock, but as a slow-building nausea, the vertigo of ground shifting beneath convictions that had seemed solid as Siberian permafrost. "You were never meant to succeed," Robert said, and the words hung in the stale air like cigarette smoke, impossible to dismiss or ignore. "You were meant to be loud, visible, capturable. Insurance against questions about how we found that Hamburg network, a narrative that would redirect attention while more valuable assets remained unexposed in the field." Pavel looked at Dmitri and saw his own betrayal reflected there, not by America, but by the hammer and sickle. They had sworn to serve unto death, discovering that death had been precisely what their service required. The water cup sat empty on the table between them, and Pavel understood now why their captors had offered it, not as psychological warfare, but as simple human recognition, one intelligence professional acknowledging that other professionals had been sacrificed by the very system they had pledged to protect. The morning light creeping through the high window carried no warmth, only the cold illumination of truths they could no longer avoid. Revelations that could not be unlearned, no matter how desperately they wished to return to yesterday's certainties. Robert closed his folder and stood without hurry, leaving the photographs scattered across the table like evidence at a crime scene where they were simultaneously victims and unwitting accomplices. "Take your time, gentlemen," he said in flawless Russian that somehow made the betrayal more complete, this American speaking their language better than some of their own handlers. had bothered to learn the operational details that might have kept them alive. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded nothing like the slam they had expected, and in the silence that followed, Pavel and Dmitri sat surrounded by images that demolished the world they had known, forced to rebuild understanding from rubble while their captors offered water and waited patiently for the architecture of belief to finish collapsing. The hours after Robert's departure stretched like interrogation sessions of their own, except the questions came from within rather than without, voiced in the intimate brutality of self-examination that no external torturer could replicate with mere physical pain. Pavel stood at the barred window watching snow begin to fall over West Berlin, each flake drifting through searchlight beams like the comfortable lies he had carried since his recruitment, melting in the harsh light of documented betrayal, leaving only the cold skeleton of truth beneath. Dmitri sat motionless at the table, fingers tracing the edges of photographs that proved their sacrifice had been planned with the same bureaucratic precision others used for requisitioning pencils or scheduling maintenance, their lives reduced to tactical assets to be expended for strategic advantage in games played by men who drank Georgian wine while their pawns bled in foreign cities. The silence between them carried weight that words would only diminish, a shared grief for the versions of themselves who had crossed into West Berlin believing in purpose, in mission, in the righteous necessity of their actions against an enemy they now understood, had treated them with more humanity than their own masters. The cells, naked bulb, cast shadows that seemed deeper than mere absence of light. Darkness that came from watching the architecture of meaning collapse, leaving them standing in ruins they had spent lifetimes constructing from loyalty and conviction and the passionate certainty of youth. "My father died at Stalingrad," Pavel finally spoke, his voice carrying the hollow quality of a man discovering his cathedral was built on sand. Foundations he had thought sanctified by blood, now revealed as nothing more sacred than political expedience and bureaucratic convenience. "I joined the service believing I honored his sacrifice, that I carried forward the protection of everything he died defending against. Fascism." He turned from the window, and Dmitri saw tears tracking down his comrade's face, not the tears of pain, but of profound disillusionment, the specific agony of realizing your devotion had been weaponized against you by those you trusted most. The photographs lay scattered like tarot cards, revealing futures already past, showing them not as heroes in a noble struggle, but as chess pieces sacrificed in an opening gambit, their capture planned and executed not by enemies, but by the hands that had pinned medals on their chests and called them comrades. Dmitri reached across the table and gripped Pavel's wrist with fierce intensity, the gesture containing everything language could not. In convey solidarity in betrayal, brotherhood in disillusionment, the desperate human need to anchor oneself to another soul, when all other moorings had been deliberately cut by superiors who valued their convenience more than their agents' lives. "The American gave us water," Dmitri said, and the simple statement contained universes of meaning, contrasting the elemental human gesture against the calculated inhumanity of their own directorate's strategic architecture. Not because his orders required it, not because manuals dictated such treatment, but because he saw two men rather than two enemies, recognized our humanity when our own side had reduced us to mathematical variables in equations we were never meant to survive solving. Pavel nodded slowly, understanding crystallizing into something harder than anger, colder than rage, a fundamental reassessment of every assumption that had guided their adult lives, forcing them to reconstruct identity from fragments while imprisoned by those they had been trained to hate and abandoned by those they had sworn to serve. The snow continued falling beyond the window, covering Berlin in white that made no distinction between East and West, American and Soviet, interrogator and prisoner, only the universal cold that touched all flesh, equally regardless of the flags men fought beneath. They sat together in that cell as the long night finally surrendered to dawn. Two men stripped of certainty, but discovering in that stripping a terrible freedom, the awful liberation of seeing clearly for the first time what devotion had previously obscured with its passionate and deliberately cultivated blindness. Outside the cell, footsteps approached with measured cadence that suggested neither urgency nor threat, simply the bureaucratic rhythm of intelligence work continuing its eternal cycles, regardless of individual revelations or personal catastrophes. The door opened to reveal Robert carrying a thermos and additional photographs, his expression containing neither triumph nor sympathy, but only professional recognition of a process reaching its inevitable conclusion. The moment when captured agents either broke completely or began the painful reconstruction of understanding on foundations less comfortable than ideology, but more durable than propaganda. "Gentlemen," he said in that same quiet Russian that had become oddly comforting in its competence and lack of malice, "there are some people in Washington who believe you might be interested in reviewing your options, now that certain facts have become clear about your operational parameters and the intentions of those who designed your mission." He placed the thermos on the table beside the scattered photographs, and Pavel noticed it was the kind that kept coffee hot for hours, the mundane domestic detail somehow making the moment more surreal. A CIA officer offering not just information but warmth, creature comfort, basic acknowledgement of their humanity, while their own service had offered them up as expendable distractions. Dmitri looked at Pavel, and in that glance passed an entire conversation about loyalty and betrayal, about which bonds remained sacred when the institutions claiming to embody those values revealed themselves as hollow, about whether men could be blamed for reconsidering allegiance to flags that had used them as convenient camouflage for more valuable assets deemed worthy of actual protection. The Glinica Bridge materialized through morning fog like something from a fever dream, its iron span connecting West Berlin to Potsdam across the Havel River. A structure that had witnessed countless exchanges where human beings were traded like livestock between superpowers that claimed to represent opposing visions of human dignity yet reduced. Their agents to identical commodities in the marketplace of espionage. Pavel stood in the back of the American sedan, feeling the weight of 6 months compressed into his chest. Half a year of interrogations that felt more like therapy sessions, of Robert's patient deconstruction of everything the Lubyanka had built inside his mind, of nights spent reading newspapers from both sides and discovering that truth lived in the uncomfortable spaces between competing propagandas, rather than cleanly on either side of the ideological divide. Dmitri sat beside him, wearing the same suit they had provided, clean and well-tailored, and Pavel remembered the shocked relief when they realized the Americans intended to return them alive rather than disappear them into the black sites their training had promised. When weeks passed without torture, without brutality, only the excruciating pain of having illusions surgically removed by someone skilled enough to do it without destroying the patient. Through the car window, he could see Soviet personnel on the eastern side of the bridge, their uniforms stark against the winter landscape, and Pavel felt his stomach tighten with an emotion he could not immediately name, until he recognized it as fear, not of American captors he was leaving, but of Soviet handlers he was returning to, men who had marked him expendable and might resent his inconvenient survival of their carefully planned sacrifice. The exchange protocol unfolded with the theatrical precision both sides seemed to require. Americans and Soviets meeting at the white line painted across the bridge's center, where authority transferred from one empire to another, where men crossed from one understanding of the world into another like travelers passing between adjacent universes governed by different physical laws. Robert walked them to the midpoint personally, and Pavel saw something in the CIA officer's expression that might have been respect or possibly regret. Recognition, perhaps, that these men were returning to uncertain fates among those who had betrayed them, while he returned to his Virginia suburb and weekend barbecues with neighbors who would never know the specifics of his work or the lives he had irrevocably altered through professional competence and unexpected mercy. "You have choices ahead," Robert said quietly in Russian before releasing them to the Soviet escort team, his final words carrying layers of meaning about futures not yet written and loyalties not yet determined, about men who had seen through constructed realities and could never again inhabit them with the comfortable blindness they had once possessed. Pavel nodded once, the gesture containing acknowledgement and gratitude and a strange sorrow for simplicity lost, then turned and walked with Dmitri across that painted line into the hands of a system that had spent them carelessly and might yet punish them for the American decency that had kept them breathing when their mission parameters had assumed their deaths. The Soviet officers who received them wore expressions of bureaucratic neutrality that concealed everything, while revealing the essential truth that Pavel and Dmitri had become complications rather than heroes. Living questions about operational planning that headquarters would prefer remained unasked by agents who had the poor taste to survive their assigned martyrdom. They were loaded into a ZIL sedan that smelled of tobacco and old leather, driven through checkpoints where guards studied their papers with unusual attention, transported not to Moscow for debriefing and decoration, but to a dacha outside Leningrad, where winter light came thin and grey through windows that had bars despite the curtains meant to disguise them. In that isolation, they waited through weeks of their own. Interrogations, this time by men who wanted to know not what they had told the Americans, but what the Americans had told them, whether the seeds of doubt had taken root, whether they remained reliable instruments of state policy or had been compromised by the insidious weapon of being treated with dignity by those they had been taught to consider monsters. Pavel and Dmitri gave careful answers that revealed nothing of the fundamental transformation that had occurred in that West Berlin cell, when water offered without cruelty had shattered certainties more effectively than any torture could have done, when documentation of their expendability had forced them to see the machinery of power, with eyes no longer clouded by the beautiful lies of patriotic devotion. They were eventually released back to limited duties, their careers effectively ended by the stain of capture, regardless of their maintained silence about the deeper wounds the Americans had inflicted through unexpected humanity, assigned to desk work where their experience could be exploited, while their contamination by Western contact could be contained and monitored. But on certain nights when snow fell over Leningrad as it had over Berlin, Pavel would stand at his window, remembering the weight of that cup of water in his hands, the simple gesture that had cost Robert nothing but had purchased something unprecedented, a crack in the absolute certainty that kept the Cold War cold by preventing either side from recognizing the complete humanity of the other. He never defected, never betrayed his oath in ways that could be documented or punished, but he carried forward into every remaining year of service a quiet question that no amount of ideology could fully silence, an understanding that mercy offered by enemies and betrayal delivered by comrades had revealed something about power and propaganda that made simple loyalty impossible for men who had seen behind the curtain and could never again pretend the show was real. What would you have done if your greatest enemy showed you more humanity than your own side? Subscribe to hear more stories that reveal the hidden truths of history's most fascinating conflicts.